In the harsh wilderness of 1870s New Mexico territory, 8-year-old Sarah Elizabeth watched her mother take her final breath in a cramped wagon. Within hours, the desperate wagon train leader made a decision that would change everything. With winter approaching and supplies running dangerously low, he traded the orphaned child to a lone Apache warrior for food and blankets that might keep the rest of them alive. Sarah expected brutality, slavery, maybe death. The Apache people were feared across the frontier, their warriors known for their fierce independence and unforgiving nature toward white settlers. But as the weathered warrior named Running Bear lifted her small frame onto his horse, something unexpected flickered in his dark eyes. It wasn't cruelty or indifference. It was recognition of a pain he knew all too well. What happens when two broken souls, separated by culture and circumstance, discover that love has no boundaries? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The journey west had begun with such hope. Sarah Elizabeth's mother, Margaret, clutched her worn leather Bible as their wagon rolled through the endless prairie grass that spring of 1873. The pages were soft from years of reading, margins filled with notes in her careful script. Margaret had pressed wildflowers between the pages during their early weeks on the trail, when everything still seemed possible. "We're going to start fresh, little bird," Margaret would whisper to Sarah as they lay beneath their thin blanket, counting stars through tears in the wagon canvas. "Your father's waiting for us in California. He's built us a house with windows that catch the morning light." But weeks turned to months, and the letters from California stopped coming. Other families on the wagon train began to whisper. Tom Bradley, their gruff wagon master with hands like leather and eyes that had seen too much, would catch Margaret's questioning glances and shake his head grimly. No word at all. The prairie gave way to desert, and desert to mountains. Margaret's cough, which had started as nothing more than dust irritation, deepened into something that rattled her chest at night. Sarah would curl against her mother's side, feeling the fever burn through the thin cotton nightgown, listening to the labored breathing that grew worse with each passing day. "Tell me about the house again, Mama," Sarah would plead, trying to distract them both from the worried voices outside their wagon. "Oh, my darling girl," Margaret's voice grew weaker each night. "It has a kitchen with a window over the sink, and in the mornings the light comes streaming in like liquid gold. There's a garden where we'll plant roses, just like my mother had back in Missouri. And your father," her voice caught, "your father will teach you to ride a proper horse, not like these stubborn mules." But Margaret knew what Sarah was too young to understand. The letters had stopped because there was no house, no father waiting. The man who had promised them a new life had likely moved on to another promise, another woman, another dream that suited him better. The fever took hold during their crossing of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Margaret's Bible became her anchor as she drifted between wakefulness and dreams. She would press it into Sarah's small hands and whisper stories about David and Goliath, about Daniel in the lion's den, about how sometimes the most unlikely people become your salvation. "Remember this, little bird," Margaret said on her final morning, her fingers tracing Sarah's face with desperate tenderness. "Goodness comes in forms you don't expect. Keep your heart open, even when everything seems dark, especially then." Tom Bradley found Sarah hours later, curled against her mother's still form, the Bible clutched against her chest. The other families gathered around the wagon, their faces drawn with the particular grief that comes from witnessing the death of hope itself. "What do we do with the child?" asked Mrs. Patterson, whose own 3 sons had survived the journey so far. "We can barely feed our own." Bradley's jaw worked silently as he studied Sarah's tear-streaked face. Winter was coming early in the high country. Their supplies were dangerously low, and they still had weeks of treacherous mountain passes ahead. Every mouth to feed was a mouth that might mean the difference between survival and starvation for the group. "We'll figure something out," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. They buried Margaret beside a mountain stream, wrapping her in the quilt she had stitched during the early hopeful days of their journey. Sarah watched the dirt fall on her mother's face and felt something fundamental break inside her chest. The Bible remained clutched in her hands, its leather cover warm from her grip. That night, as Sarah sat alone by their small fire, Tom Bradley approached with news that would change everything. A lone Apache warrior had been watching their camp from the ridgeline. Bradley had recognized the signs, the way shadows moved differently when you were being observed. "He's got supplies," Bradley said quietly to the other men, not knowing Sarah was listening. "Food, blankets, things we need to make it through the next pass. But he wants something in return." The men's voices carried across the camp in hushed, urgent tones. Sarah pressed herself closer to the dying embers of their fire, straining to hear words that would seal her fate. "He's been following us for 2 days," Bradley continued, his weathered face grim in the firelight, "staying just out of rifle range, but close enough to let us know he's there." "Could be scouting for a war party," suggested Jim Patterson, instinctively checking his rifle. "No." Bradley shook his head. "This one's alone, and he's not looking for a fight. He wants to trade." The reality of their situation hung heavy in the mountain air. 3 families, 22 souls, including the children, with barely enough supplies to last another week. The early snow had already dusted the high peaks, and they were still days away from the easier slopes that would lead them down into warmer valleys. "What does he want?" Mrs. Patterson's voice was barely a whisper. Bradley's eyes found Sarah across the camp, sitting small and alone by her mother's wagon. The girl. The silence that followed was the kind that changes everything. Sarah felt the weight of their stares, understood in that moment that her fate was being decided by people who saw her not as a child who had just lost everything, but as a burden they could no longer afford. "Tom, we can't." Mrs. Patterson's protest was weak, more obligation than conviction. "We can't feed her," Bradley replied bluntly, "and she can't contribute to the work. Come winter, she'll be the first to starve anyway." Sarah's fingers tightened around her mother's Bible. The leather was smooth beneath her palms, worn soft by years of faithful handling. Inside, pressed between the pages of Psalms, were the wildflowers her mother had picked during their first weeks on the trail, when the world still held promise. "What if he hurts her?" Jim Patterson asked, though his tone suggested he was looking for reassurance rather than voicing real concern. "Apaches don't usually keep white captives," Bradley said. "More likely he'll trade her to someone else, maybe Mexican traders heading south. At least she'll have a chance." "A chance?" Sarah almost laughed at the cruel irony. Her mother had died believing they were heading toward a chance at a new life. Now that same word was being used to justify trading her away like a sack of grain. The meeting broke up with grim nods and averted eyes. Mrs. Patterson approached Sarah's fire, her face a mask of forced kindness. "Come now, dear, you'll sleep with us tonight." Sarah didn't move. "I want to stay with Mama's things. Your mother wouldn't want you sleeping alone. She wouldn't want you to sell me either." The harsh truth hung between them. Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled slightly, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she knelt beside Sarah and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make impossible choices," she said softly. "It doesn't mean we don't care about you." That night, Sarah lay wrapped in her mother's quilt, listening to the soft sounds of the camp settling into uneasy sleep. She opened the Bible and traced her finger over the familiar passages, finding comfort in the words her mother had read to her countless times. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The verse blurred through her tears. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Still waters. Sarah thought of the stream where they had buried her mother, how peaceful it had sounded as it whispered over the rocks. Maybe that was where her mother was now, beside those still waters, finally at rest. In the distance a coyote howled, answered by another from across the valley. Sarah clutched the Bible closer and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Her mother had said,
Goodness came in unexpected forms. Maybe, just maybe, she had meant this too. When dawn broke grey and cold over the mountains, Sarah was ready. She had braided her hair the way her mother taught her, washed her face with water from the stream, and tucked the Bible safely inside her coat. If she was going to meet her fate, she would meet it with the dignity her mother had tried to teach her. The Apache warrior sat motionless on his horse at the edge of their camp, waiting. Running Bear had watched the white child for 3 days before making his decision. From his position on the ridgeline, he had observed her gentle care of the dying woman, the way she read from the black book with reverent fingers, how she sat vigil through the long night hours when death was near. He recognized grief. It wore the same face in every culture. The exchange happened without ceremony. Tom Bradley approached with nervous steps, Sarah's small hand gripped tightly in his weathered one. The child's eyes were red-rimmed but dry, her chest set with the kind of desperate courage that comes from having no other choice.
Running Bear dismounted and studied her carefully. She was smaller than his own daughter had been, with hair the color of autumn grass and eyes like winter sky. Her dress was patched and travel-worn, but clean. She clutched a black book against her chest, as if it contained all the world's secrets. Bradley held out his other hand, showing the supplies he expected in return. Dried meat, blankets, woven with traditional patterns, medicine pouches that might keep his people alive through the mountain passes. Running Bear nodded once and made the trade, lifting Sarah onto his horse with hands that were surprisingly gentle. As they rode away from the camp, Sarah twisted in the saddle to watch the wagons grow smaller behind them. She expected Running Bear to bind her hands, to treat her roughly, now that the transaction was complete. Instead, he adjusted his blanket around her shoulders when the morning wind picked up, and spoke to her in a voice so soft she almost missed it. "Crying dove," he said in Apache, then repeated it in the broken English he had learned from traders. "You cry for your mother, like dove that has lost her nest." Sarah said nothing, but tears she had been holding back finally began to fall. Running Bear didn't try to stop them or tell her to be brave. He simply rode steadily through the pine forest, letting her grieve against his shoulder as his horse picked its way down familiar trails. The Apache blanket wrapped around her shoulders was unlike anything Sarah had ever felt. The wool was soft yet strong, woven with patterns that told stories she couldn't read. Deep reds and browns created geometric shapes that seemed to move in her peripheral vision, like a living thing breathing with the rhythm of the horse beneath them. "This belonged to my grandmother," Running Bear said, noticing how she touched the weaving with curious fingers. She said, "Every thread holds a prayer." They rode for hours through country that grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile. Red rock formations rose from the earth like ancient temples, and eagles circled overhead in lazy spirals. Sarah had never seen land like this, so different from the gentle hills of Missouri where she was born. When they stopped to rest beside a clear stream, Running Bear helped her down from the horse and showed her how to cup her hands to drink. The water was shockingly cold and tasted of snow and stone. Sarah gasped at the first sip, and Running Bear's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "Good water," he said, "from sacred mountains, makes you strong." Sarah looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by sun and wind and years of hard living, but his eyes held kindness. And when he handed her a piece of dried meat to eat, his movements were careful and patient. "Why did you want me?" she asked quietly, the first words she had spoken since leaving the wagon train. Running Bear was quiet for a long time, gazing across the water toward distant peaks. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old sorrow. "I had daughter once, same age as you. She died with her mother when the spotted sickness came to our camp." He looked at Sarah with eyes that understood loss. "Maybe Great Spirit sends you to ease old man's empty heart. Maybe he sends old man to protect small girl who has no one." Sarah's grip tightened on her mother's Bible. The leather cover was warm from the sun, solid and real in a world that had become uncertain and strange. "I don't know your language," she whispered. "You will learn," Running Bear replied gently. "I will teach you, and you will teach me more of your words. We help each other." As they prepared to continue their journey, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the absence of despair. The Apache blanket around her shoulders felt less like a shroud and more like an embrace. The Apache camp appeared gradually through the late afternoon haze, emerging from the landscape as if the earth itself had given birth to dwellings. Wickiups made of bent saplings and brush dotted a natural meadow beside a swift-running creek. Smoke rose from several fires, and Sarah could hear voices speaking in the musical language she was beginning to recognize as Apache. Children noticed them first, pointing and chattering as Running Bear's horse approached. Their dark eyes followed Sarah with curious intensity, taking in her pale skin and strange clothing. She pressed closer to Running Bear's back, suddenly aware of how different she must look to them. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger wickiups, her silver hair braided with colored beads that caught the sunlight. Her face was a map of years lived fully, lined with the marks of both joy and sorrow. She spoke rapidly to Running Bear in Apache, her tone questioning but not unkind. Running Bear dismounted and lifted Sarah down with the same gentle care he had shown all day. He spoke to the woman in their language, gesturing toward Sarah with respect rather than ownership. The conversation continued for several minutes while Sarah stood quietly, still clutching her mother's Bible. "This is Gentle Rain," Running Bear finally said to Sarah in English. "She is grandmother to all children here. She will teach you our ways." Gentle Rain approached Sarah slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. She knelt to Sarah's eye level and spoke in heavily accented English. "You are welcome in our camp, little white dove. Running Bear tells me you have lost your mother." Her weathered hand touched Sarah's cheek with surprising tenderness. "I too know what it means to lose what is most precious." Other members of the camp began to gather, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly curious about their newest member. Sarah saw faces that ranged from openly welcoming to carefully neutral. A few of the younger men watched her with expressions she couldn't read, though not threatening. Running Bear seemed to sense her nervousness. "They wonder about you, as you wonder about them. This is natural. Time will teach understanding." That evening, as cooking fires were lit and the day's activities wound down, Sarah found herself sitting beside Running Bear outside his wickiup. Gentle Rain had brought them bowls of stew made with meat Sarah didn't recognize, seasoned with herbs that were foreign, but not unpleasant. "What is this?" Sarah asked, taking a tentative bite. "Rabbit," Running Bear replied, "with wild onions and sage. Good food that makes you strong for winter." As they ate in comfortable silence, Running Bear began working on something with his hands. Sarah watched as he took a piece of smooth wood and began carving it with a small, sharp knife. His movements were precise and patient, each cut deliberate and sure. "What are you making?" she asked. "Gift for young girl who has lost everything," he said without looking up from his work. "In our way, when someone joins our family, we give them something to show they belong." Sarah's heart caught at the word family. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't considered what her place in this camp might actually be. "Am I part of your family now?" Running Bear's hand stilled on the carving. He looked at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Do you wish to be?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from the fire. Sarah thought of the wagon train, already miles away, and moving farther with each passing hour. She thought of the father she had never met, who might not even exist. She thought of her mother's words about goodness coming in unexpected forms. "I don't know what it means," she said honestly. "It means you have place here, name here, people who will teach you and protect you and care for you when you are sick." Running Bear's voice was steady and sure. "It means you are not alone in the world." As if to demonstrate his words, Gentle Rain appeared beside their fire,
with an armload of soft materials. She sat down and began sorting through furs and leather pieces, speaking to Running Bear in rapid Apache. "She wants to make you proper clothing for our climate," Running Bear translated. "And moccasin so your feet don't freeze when the snow comes." Sarah looked down at her worn eastern boots, already cracked from the journey. The practical kindness of the gesture moved her more than grand speeches might have. Over the following days, Sarah's world expanded in ways she never could have imagined. Gentle Rain became her patient teacher, showing her how to identify edible plants, how to prepare food in the Apache way, and how to move and how to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the animals. Watching.
Gentle Rain whispered one morning as they knelt beside the creek. She cupped her hands and brought water to her lips, then gestured for Sarah to do the same. "Give thanks to water before you drink. All life comes from water." Sarah found herself learning more than just survival skills. She was learning a different way of seeing the world, one where every element of nature held meaning and deserved respect. When they gathered berries, Gentle Rain taught her to take only what they needed, leaving plenty for the birds and other creatures who shared the mountain. Running Bear continued his patient carving each evening, the wooden shape gradually taking form under his skilled hands. Sarah watched him work, fascinated by his concentration and the reverence he showed for his materials. "Wood has spirit too," he explained one night, noticing her attention. "Tree gave its life, so we must honor that gift by making something worthy." The carving was becoming recognizable now as a small doll, about the length of Sarah's hand, but this was unlike any doll she had ever seen. The face was carefully detailed with traditional Apache features, and Running Bear was beginning to add tiny clothes made from scraps of leather and fabric. "She will have her own name," Running Bear said, smoothing the doll's wooden hair with gentle strokes. "When she is finished, she will be ready to watch over a young girl who is far from the place where she was born." Sarah's eyes filled with unexpected tears. No one had made anything just for her since her mother died. The practical gifts of clothing and food were kindness, but this doll was something more. It was proof that Running Bear saw her not just as a responsibility, but as someone worthy of time and care. "What will you call her?" Sarah asked. "That is for you to decide. She will be yours." As the days passed, Sarah began to understand the rhythms of camp life. She learned that the Apache people lived in harmony with the changing seasons, moving their camps to follow game and find the best grazing for their horses. She discovered that their society was built on principles of sharing and mutual support that were different from what she had known in the white world. The children of the camp, initially shy, began to include her in their games. They taught her Apache words through play, giggling when she mispronounced something, but always encouraging her to try again. Sarah found herself laughing for the first time since her mother's death, caught up in a game of hiding among the rocks by the creek. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the high peaks visible from their camp, Running Bear presented Sarah with the finished doll. The little figure was beautiful in its simplicity, with a serene face and traditional Apache dress complete with tiny beaded details. "She is called a higa," Running Bear said, placing the doll carefully in Sarah's hands. "It means she fights, because sometimes little girls must be very strong." Sarah held the doll close to her chest, feeling the smooth wood warm under her touch. "She's perfect," she whispered. "Now you have someone to talk to when old man's words are not enough," Running Bear said with gentle humor. "She will listen to your secrets and keep them safe." That night, Sarah lay in the wickiup that had become her home, the doll nestled beside her and her mother's Bible tucked safely under her blanket. For the first time since leaving Missouri, she felt something that might eventually become happiness. Outside, she could hear Running Bear speaking quietly with Gentle Rain in Apache. Though she couldn't understand all the words, she caught her own name and felt the warmth of their concern for her well-being. These people who had been strangers just days ago were already becoming something precious to her. As sleep finally came, Sarah whispered a prayer from her mother's Bible, adding her own words at the end. "Thank you for sending me people who care," she said to the darkness. "Help me be worthy of their kindness." The wooden doll seemed to smile in the firelight, standing guard over a little girl who was slowly learning that home wasn't a place, but the people who chose to love you. Winter settled over the mountain camp like a familiar blanket, bringing with it rhythms that Sarah was beginning to understand. The Apache people prepared for the cold months, with practices refined over generations, and Sarah found herself drawn into their quiet wisdom. Gentle Rain spent long hours teaching her to work with leather and sinew, showing her how to make the soft, warm moccasins that would keep her feet dry in the snow. Sarah's first attempts were clumsy, her fingers unused to the delicate work, but Gentle Rain never showed impatience. "Patience teaches good medicine," the older woman would say, guiding Sarah's hands through the proper motions. "Hurried work brings no blessing." The moccasins took shape slowly under their combined efforts. Made from deer hide that Running Bear had prepared with careful attention to traditional methods, they were far more than simple footwear. Gentle Rain showed Sarah how to decorate them with tiny beads and quill work, each design carrying meaning. "These patterns tell story of mountain people," Gentle Rain explained, pointing to the geometric shapes emerging under Sarah's careful stitches. "This one is for protection on long journeys. This one calls good spirits to watch over your steps." Sarah found deep satisfaction in the work. Each tiny bead required focus and precision, leaving no room in her mind for the grief that still visited her in quiet moments. Her fingers grew more skilled with each passing day, and she began to understand why the Apache people took such pride in their craftsmanship. Running Bear watched her progress with approval, often sitting nearby in the evenings to continue his own work on winter preparations. He was teaching her Apache words during these sessions, pointing to objects around their wickiup and repeating their names until she could pronounce them correctly. "Key," he would say, touching the ground. "Earth, key," Sarah would repeat, rolling the unfamiliar sounds around her tongue. "Yas," he continued, pointing upward. "Snow." The language was unlike English in every way, with sounds that seemed to flow like water over stones, but Sarah found herself picking it up more quickly than she had expected. "Children," Running Bear told her, "learned languages the way birds learn songs, naturally and without fear." One evening, as snow began to fall in earnest outside their warm shelter, Running Bear shared stories that helped Sarah understand more about the man who had become her protector. His voice grew distant as he spoke of his wife, White Morning, and their daughter, Little Hawk. "She was like you," he said, his weathered hands working steadily on a new pair of winter leggings. "Curious about everything, always asking questions that made me think in new ways." "How did they die?" Sarah asked gently, surprising herself with her boldness. Running Bear was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain made bearable by time. "Spotted sickness came from traders, white man's disease that our medicine could not cure. Many people died that winter. My heart died with them." Sarah's hand found the wooden doll, Ahiga, who had become her constant companion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Great Spirit has strange ways," Running Bear replied, looking at her with eyes that held both sadness and something that might have been gratitude. "Maybe he brings young Apache girl and old warrior together so both hearts can heal." The observation struck Sarah with unexpected force. She had been so focused on her own loss, her own fear, that she hadn't considered that Running Bear might need healing too. The idea that she might be able to give something back to this man who had shown her such kindness was both humbling and hopeful. As the fire crackled between them and snow whispered against the wickiup walls, Sarah made a decision that surprised her. She opened her mother's Bible to one of her favorite passages and began to read aloud, translating as best she could into the Apache words she was learning. "The Lord is my shepherd," she began slowly, searching for the right sounds. Running Bear listened with careful attention, occasionally helping her find words when her vocabulary failed. By the time she finished the psalm, tears were running down both their faces. Not tears of sadness, exactly, but tears of recognition. They were two people who had lost everything, finding in each other the possibility of family renewed. The moccasins were finished on a crisp morning when frost painted the world silver. Sarah slipped them onto her feet with reverence, feeling the soft deer hide mold to her shape like a second skin. The beadwork caught the early sunlight, each tiny bead a prayer for safe travel and protection. "How do they feel?" Gentle Rain asked, watching Sarah take her first steps in properly made Apache footwear. "Like walking on clouds," Sarah replied, marveling at how quietly her feet moved across the ground. The thick soles cushioned every step, while the high tops provided warmth that her worn eastern boots had never offered. Running Bear nodded approvingly. "Now you can move like mountain people. Quiet feet, respectful steps." That day marked a turning point in Sarah's integration into the camp. Other members of the tribe began to acknowledge her presence in new ways, offering small nods of greeting and including her in daily activities. The children, who had been gradually warming to her, now treated her almost as one of their own. She spent her days learning skills that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. Gentle Rain taught her to identify animal tracks in the snow, to find winter roots that could sustain life when hunting was poor, and to read the sky for signs of coming weather. "Earth speaks to those who listen," Gentle Rain would say as they knelt beside a frozen stream, pointing out the subtle signs that indicated where fish might be resting beneath the ice. "Your people have forgotten how to hear, but Apache remember." Sarah found herself thinking often about the differences between her old world and this new one. In the white settlements, people seemed to see themselves as separate from nature, constantly fighting against it or trying to control it. Here she was learning to live as part of the natural world, taking only what was needed and giving thanks for every gift. The evenings had become her favorite time. As the camp settled into the peaceful rhythms of night, she would sit with Running Bear beside their fire, practicing her Apache while he continued his patient teaching. Their conversations had grown deeper as her vocabulary expanded, touching on subjects that surprised her with their complexity. "Why did you choose to take me?" she asked one night, the question that had been burning in her heart since their first meeting. Running Bear was quiet for a long time, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. When he spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "When my daughter died, part of my spirit went with her to the land beyond. I thought it would never return." He paused, studying Sarah's face in the firelight. "But when I saw you sitting beside your mother's wagon, reading from your sacred book with such love, I saw Little Hawk's spirit looking back at me." Sarah's breath caught. "You think I'm her?" "No," Running Bear said gently. "You are Sarah, daughter of Margaret, child of the eastern places. But spirits call to spirits across the darkness. Maybe Little Hawk sent you to help old man remember how to love without fear." The words settled between them like a blessing. Sarah touched the wooden doll nestled in her arms, thinking about the mysterious ways that grief and healing could intertwine. "I was so angry when they traded me away," she admitted. "I thought it meant I was worthless." "Traders saw only burden," Running Bear replied. "But Great Spirit sees connections that mortal eyes cannot follow. Sometimes what looks like ending is really beginning." As winter deepened around their mountain camp, Sarah began to understand what he meant. Each day brought new lessons, new moments of connection with her Apache family. She was learning to see herself not as a displaced white child, but as someone who belonged in this place, with these people. Her mother's Bible remained her nightly companion, but now she read it with Apache eyes, finding new meanings in familiar passages. The stories of exile and adoption, of strangers becoming family, seemed to speak directly to her situation. One snowy evening, as she sat working on a new pair of winter mittens under Gentle Rain's patient guidance, Sarah realized something had shifted inside her heart.
The constant ache of missing her mother was still there, but it no longer consumed her every thought. In its place was growing something she had thought lost forever, the possibility of joy. The moccasins on her feet carried her forward into each new day, with steps that were learning to be confident again. She was becoming someone new while honoring who she had always been.
Spring came to the mountains with the gradual persistence of hope itself. Sarah watched the snow melt into rushing streams that sang through the valleys, carrying winter away piece by piece. She had survived her first season with the Apache people, and the girl who emerged from winter was someone her mother might barely have recognized. Her hair had grown longer and was now braided in the Apache style, decorated with small beads that gentle rain had given her. Her skin was bronze from sun and wind, and her hands bore the calluses of useful work. But the most profound changes were ones that couldn't be seen: a confidence in her movements, a peace in her eyes that spoke of belonging. The camp prepared for their seasonal move to lower ground, where early grass would provide better grazing for their horses and hunting would be more plentiful. Sarah helped with the preparations, her contributions now valued rather than merely tolerated. "Crying dove has become mountain flower," observed one of the tribal elders, watching Sarah efficiently pack their winter supplies with practiced hands. "She grows strong in our soil." The elder's words reached Running Bear, who smiled with quiet pride. Sarah had indeed become something beautiful in their community, her gentle nature and eager willingness to learn earning respect from even the most traditional members of their band. During a ceremony marking the arrival of spring, the tribal leaders made a decision that would change Sarah's status forever. Chief Gray Wolf, the respected leader of their band, approached Running Bear with formal gravity. "The council has spoken," he announced in Apache, his voice carrying the weight of official judgment. "The white child has proven herself worthy of our people. If you wish it, she may receive the beaded headband of acceptance." Sarah understood enough Apache now to catch the meaning, though Running Bear translated the formal words for her. The beaded headband was more than decoration. It was a symbol of full membership in the tribe, recognition that she had earned her place among them through character rather than birth. "Do you want this honor?" Running Bear asked her gently. "It means you choose to be Apache in your heart, even as you remember the mother who gave you life." Sarah thought of her mother's words about goodness coming in unexpected forms. Margaret could never have imagined her daughter living among the Apache people, but Sarah felt certain her mother would have approved of the love and wisdom she had found here. "Yes," she said simply, "this is my family now." The ceremony took place at sunset, with the entire camp gathered in a circle around the central fire. Chief Gray Wolf spoke about the traditions of their people, about how adoption into the tribe was as sacred as birth into it. He recounted Sarah's journey from frightened child to valued member of their community. Gentle Rain approached, carrying the beaded headband on a piece of soft deerskin. The headband was a work of art, with intricate patterns in blue and white beads that told the story of sky meeting earth. Small feathers and silver ornaments caught the firelight as she held it up for all to see. "This headband was made by the women of our tribe," Chief Gray Wolf announced. "Each bead was placed with prayers for the one who would wear it. Each pattern carries the protection of our ancestors." As Gentle Rain placed the headband on Sarah's brow, the assembled tribe began to sing in low, harmonious voices. The sound seemed to rise from the earth itself, connecting Sarah to generations of Apache people who had welcomed strangers and made them family. Running Bear's eyes shone with unshed tears as he watched his adopted daughter receive this highest honor. In Apache culture, family was not limited by blood, but expanded through choice and love. Sarah had chosen them, and they had chosen her in return. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued with food and stories, Sarah sat beside Running Bear and gazed up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. The beaded headband felt solid and real against her forehead, a tangible reminder of her new identity. "Do you think my mother would understand?" she asked quietly. Running Bear considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. Your mother taught you to find goodness in unexpected places. She would see that you have found more than goodness here. You have found home. The seasons that followed brought a rhythm of contentment that Sarah had never known. She learned to read the subtle signs that told the Apache people when to move their camps, when to hunt, when to gather the plants that would sustain them through the harsh months. Running Bear became more than her protector. He became her teacher in all the ways that mattered. He showed her how to track animals through dense forest, how to find water in country that looked barren to untrained eyes, and how to move through the wilderness without leaving traces that unfriendly eyes might follow. Apache must be like wind, he taught her during a hunting expedition. Present but invisible, felt but not seen. Sarah absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge might mean the difference between life and death. But more than survival skills, Running Bear was teaching her a philosophy of living that honored the interconnectedness of all things. During their summer camp, in a high meadow starred with wildflowers, Sarah began to understand that the Apache way of life was under threat. Conversations around the evening fires had grown more serious, with frequent mentions of blue soldiers and white settlers pushing ever westward. "They come like locust swarms," observed one of the warriors, his voice tight with anger, "taking everything, leaving nothing for those who were here first." Sarah felt torn when these discussions arose. She was white by blood, Apache by choice, and the growing conflict between her two worlds created confusion in her heart. Running Bear seemed to sense her struggle and spoke to her privately about it. "You did not choose the color of your skin any more than stream chooses the color of stones in its bed," he said as they sat beside a mountain lake. "What matters is the color of your heart, and your heart beats Apache." The wisdom of his words helped ease her internal conflict, but couldn't eliminate the larger tensions building around them. Reports came from other bands about increasing pressure from military patrols and settlers who saw Apache lands as territory to be claimed rather than homes to be respected. During this time, Sarah's relationship with Running Bear deepened in ways that surprised them both. He began sharing stories about his youth, his training as a warrior, and the spiritual beliefs that guided Apache life. In return, Sarah told him about her early memories of Missouri, her father who had disappeared, and the dreams her mother had carried west. "Your mother was brave," Running Bear said, after Sarah described Margaret's determination to build a new life. "She gave you strength that lives in your bones." One evening, as they prepared for their autumn move to winter quarters, Running Bear made a decision that would change everything. He called Sarah to sit beside him and spoke with unusual formality. "I have something to ask you," he began, his weathered hands folded carefully in his lap. In Apache way, when man raises child that is not born to him, he can choose to make adoption complete through ceremony. Child takes his name and becomes his true daughter in eyes of spirits. Sarah's heart began to race. She understood the magnitude of what he was offering. "If you wish this," Running Bear continued, "you would no longer be Sarah Elizabeth, white child living with Apache. You would be Crying Dove, who became Mountain Flower, daughter of Running Bear, member of Wind Clan." The decision felt enormous, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing whether to leap. Taking Running Bear's name would sever her last formal connection to the white world, while cementing her place in the Apache one. "Would I still be me?" she asked quietly. "You would be yourself, but with Apache heart made official," Running Bear replied. "Your mother's love would still live in you, her Bible would still guide your spirit, but you would belong completely to this family, this people." Sarah thought of the beaded headband she wore, of the moccasins that carried her so quietly through the forest, of the language that now flowed from her tongue as naturally as English. She thought of gentle rain's patient teaching and the acceptance she had found among people who had every reason to distrust someone who looked like her. Most of all, she thought of the man beside her who had chosen love over convenience, who had seen past her pale skin to the person she was becoming. Yes,
She said simply, "I want to be your daughter in every way." The military dispatch arrived at their winter camp on a bitter February morning, carried by a young Apache scout whose horse was lathered with sweat despite the freezing air. The urgency in his movements as he dismounted sent a ripple of tension through the camp that Sarah felt in her bones. Chief Grey Wolf emerged from his wickiup to receive the message, his face growing increasingly grave as the scout spoke in rapid Apache. Sarah caught fragments of the conversation, words about soldiers, about a cavalry regiment, about someone called Iron Hawk, who was leading campaigns against Apache settlements. Running Bear was summoned to the chief's council, leaving Sarah to wait with growing anxiety. When he returned hours later, his face was etched with a pain she had never seen before. "What is it?" she asked, her heart already knowing that their peaceful world was about to shatter. Running Bear sat heavily beside their fire, the military dispatch still clutched in his weathered hands. The paper was official, bearing the seal of the United States Army, written in the formal language of military orders. Sarah could read enough of the English text to understand its basic meaning, but Running Bear's translation revealed the devastating truth. "This paper tells of cavalry officer named Colonel William Morrison," Running Bear said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. "He leads regiment that has destroyed 3 Apache camps in past month. They call him Iron Hawk because he shows no mercy." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Morrison. Her mother's maiden name had been Morrison. But surely it was coincidence. Morrison was a common enough surname in the territories.
The paper says he searches for stolen white children. Running Bear continued, his dark eyes watching Sarah's face with growing concern. Says he will not rest until every white captive is returned to civilization. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "I'm not captive. I'm your daughter." Running Bear's hands trembled slightly as he held up the dispatch. "There is more. This Colonel Morrison, he claims to search for his own daughter. Girl named Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, taken from wagon train 2 years ago." The world seemed to tilt around Sarah as the truth crashed over her like a mountain avalanche. The father she had never met, the man her mother had believed would give them a new life in California, was not only alive but was the very officer hunting Apache people with ruthless determination. "It can't be true," she said. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were. The timeline fit perfectly. Her mother had been traveling west to join a man named William Morrison. That man was now a colonel in the cavalry, and he believed his daughter had been stolen by the very people who had become her true family. Running Bear set the dispatch aside and took Sarah's hands in his own. "Your blood father lives," he said gently, "but he does not know you chose this life. He thinks you are prisoner here." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If her biological father was leading military campaigns against Apache settlements, how long before he found their camp? What would happen when he discovered that his lost daughter had become not just adopted Apache, but a willing member of the tribe he was trying to destroy? "He's killed Apache people," she said, horror creeping into her voice. "He's destroyed families like ours. He believes he fights to save you," Running Bear replied, though his tone carried no forgiveness for the colonel's actions. In his mind, he is rescuing daughter from savages. The bitter irony was not lost on either of them. Colonel Morrison was destroying the very people who had saved his daughter's life, who had given her love and purpose when his own absence had left her orphaned and abandoned. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Running Bear was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if seeking wisdom in the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of impossible choices. "If we run, he will follow. If we fight, people die. If we stay." He paused, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah understood. If they stayed, her father would eventually find them, and the confrontation would tear apart everything she had built with the Apache people. She would be forced to choose between the man who had given her life and the man who had given her a life worth living. The military dispatch lay between them like a death sentence, its official words spelling the end of the peaceful world they had created together. The days following the revelation moved with the strange, suspended quality of a dream that might at any moment become a nightmare. Sarah watched Running Bear make quiet preparations that spoke of a man readying himself for the end of the world he had known. He spent long hours in council with Chief Grey Wolf and the other elders, their voices low and urgent as they discussed options that all seemed to lead toward heartbreak. Sarah wasn't included in these meetings, but she could read the weight of decision in Running Bear's increasingly distant expression. On the third night, he came to her with something precious wrapped in soft deerskin. His movements were deliberate, ceremonial, as he knelt beside their fire and slowly unwrapped an eagle feather that seemed to glow in the flickering light. "This belonged to my grandfather," Running Bear said, his voice thick with emotion, "and his grandfather before him. It has been in our family for 7 generations. Sarah had never seen anything so beautiful. The feather was perfect, its barred pattern speaking of the sacred bird that had given its life for this honor. Tiny beads and strips of leather adorned the quill, each decoration telling part of a story that reached back through time. In Apache tradition, Running Bear continued, "Eagle feather is given only to those who have shown greatest courage. Warriors who risk everything to protect their people. Mothers who sacrifice for their children. Those who choose the hard path because it is the right path." He held the feather out to Sarah, his dark eyes reflecting decades of wisdom and pain. "You will need courage for what comes next, daughter. This will remind you that eagle soars highest when wind blows hardest." Sarah's hands shook as she accepted the sacred gift. The feather felt warm and alive beneath her fingers, as if it still carried the spirit of the magnificent bird that had once worn it. "Are you giving this to me because you think I'm going to leave?" she asked, the words scraping her throat raw. Running Bear's silence was answer enough. Sarah felt her world cracking apart like ice in spring flood. The man who had become everything to her was preparing to let her go, and the nobility of his sacrifice made it hurt even more. "I don't want to leave," she said fiercely. "This is my home, you're my father. These are my people, and Colonel Morrison is your blood." Running Bear replied gently, "He has right to claim you that even Apache law recognizes. He abandoned us." Sarah's voice rose with anger she hadn't known she was holding. "He left my mother to die on a wagon train while he played soldier. You're the one who saved me, who loved me, who made me family." Running Bear reached out and touched her face with the tenderness that had marked every interaction between them since that first day. "Blood does not make family," he said, "but sometimes blood demands answers." That night Sarah lay awake clutching the eagle feather and trying to imagine a future that made sense. Every possibility seemed to require abandoning something essential to who she had become. If she stayed with the Apache, her presence would bring military pursuit that could destroy the people she loved. If she went with her father, she would be forced back into a white world that no longer fit her like a coat outgrown. The next morning brought news that made all their careful planning meaningless. Scouts reported cavalry movements less than 2 days' ride from their camp. Colonel Morrison was coming, and he was coming soon. The camp erupted into controlled activity as families began the hasty preparations for emergency relocation. But Chief Grey Wolf made a decision that surprised everyone. They would not run. "We are tired of running," he announced to the assembled tribe. "If Iron Hawk wants to find us, let him come. We will meet him with dignity, as Apache people should." Sarah understood what this meant. Her father would arrive to find not a cowering band of savages holding his daughter captive, but a proud people living according to ancient traditions of honor. The confrontation she had been dreading was about to become inevitable. Running Bear spent their final evening together teaching Sarah a song in Apache, one that spoke of eagles soaring above mountains that touched the sky. His voice was steady as he sang, but she could see the tears he refused to shed. "Promise me something," he said as the song ended. "No matter what happens tomorrow, remember that you are Mountain Flower, daughter of Running Bear,
that can never be taken from you. Sarah held the eagle feather against her heart and made the promise, knowing she would keep it even if keeping it broke her in two. The cavalry arrived with the morning mist, emerging from the tree line like ghosts given solid form. Sarah watched from behind Running Bear as the blue uniformed soldiers arranged themselves in precise military formation, their weapons ready but not yet raised. At their head rode a man whose bearing spoke of absolute authority and unshakable purpose. Colonel William Morrison was not what Sarah had expected. Her mother's stories had painted him as young and handsome, full of dreams about their future together. The man who dismounted from his horse was weathered by years of frontier service, his face marked by the kind of hardness that comes from making impossible decisions. But his eyes, pale blue like her own, held a desperate hope that made Sarah's heart constrict with unexpected sympathy. Chief Grey Wolf stepped forward with the dignity that had marked his leadership for decades. He raised his hand in the universal gesture of peace, speaking clearly in English so there could be no misunderstanding. "I am Grey Wolf, leader of this band. We welcome you to our camp, though we did not invite your coming." Colonel Morrison's gaze swept across the assembled Apache people, clearly searching for something specific. When his eyes found Sarah standing beside Running Bear in her traditional dress and beaded headband, his face went through a series of expressions too quick to follow. "Sarah," his voice cracked on her name. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, the sound of her birth name spoken aloud felt strange after so long. Sarah felt Running Bear's hand touch her shoulder, a gesture of support that gave her strength to step forward. "I am Mountain Flower," she said clearly, using the English words but with the proud bearing Running Bear had taught her. "Daughter of Running Bear, member of the Wind Clan." Colonel Morrison dismounted completely, his movements careful as if approaching a wounded animal. "My God," he whispered, "I've been searching for you for 2 years. Your mother, what happened to your mother?" "She died of fever on the wagon train." "She died of fever on the wagon train," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "These people saved my life when yours abandoned me." The accusation hit Colonel Morrison like a physical blow.
Sarah could see him struggling to understand how the rescue he had imagined had become something far more complicated. "You don't understand," he said, his voice growing urgent. "I was establishing our home in California. I sent money for your passage. When I received word that your wagon train had been attacked by hostiles, I thought..." He stopped, unable to finish. "You thought I was dead," Sarah said quietly. "So you became a soldier instead of a father." Running Bear stepped forward then, his presence commanding attention without aggression. "Your daughter was dying when she came to us," he said in careful English. "Grief had broken her spirit. We gave her reason to live again." Colonel Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, then stopped as he took in the scene before him. Sarah wasn't cowering in fear or begging for rescue. She stood tall beside the Apache warrior, her bearing proud and unafraid. The love between them was obvious to anyone with eyes to see. "They made you one of them," Colonel Morrison said, and Sarah couldn't tell if it was wonder or horror in his voice. "They made me family," Sarah corrected. "They gave me a father who stayed." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Sarah saw her biological father flinch as if she had struck him, and she felt a stab of regret for causing pain. But the truth needed to be spoken. "I can take you away from here," Colonel Morrison said, his voice desperate now. "Back to civilization, to schools, to the life your mother wanted for you." Sarah touched the eagle feather tucked against her heart, drawing strength from its sacred power. "My mother wanted me to find goodness in unexpected places," she said. "I found it here." She reached into her dress and pulled out her mother's silver locket, the one treasure from her old life that she had carried through everything. Opening it revealed the faded photograph of her parents on their wedding day, young and full of hope. "She loved you," Sarah said, offering the locket to Colonel Morrison. "But love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. Running Bear chose to love me when I was broken. You chose to hunt the people who saved me." The moment stretched between them like a bridge that might bear weight or might collapse entirely. Two fathers, two worlds, and one young woman who had to choose where she belonged. Colonel Morrison stared at the locket in his hands, his weathered fingers tracing the delicate silver edges as if they held all the dreams he had lost. The photograph inside showed a younger version of himself, standing beside Margaret, both of them radiant with the hope that had carried them west, toward a future they would never share. "I never stopped looking for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even when the army declared you dead, I kept searching. I became Iron Hawk, because I thought, if I could break their resistance, find their camps, I might find you." Sarah felt the weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders like snow. How many Apache families had been destroyed by her father's misguided love? How many children had been orphaned by his desperate search for the daughter he thought was captive? "You found me," she said gently, "but not the way you expected." Running Bear stepped closer, his presence steady and calming. "Your daughter speaks truth from her heart," he said to Colonel Morrison. "She is not prisoner here. She is beloved child who chose to stay." The colonel's pale eyes moved between Sarah and Running Bear, struggling to reconcile the reality before him with 2 years of assumptions and military planning. His soldiers waited behind him in disciplined silence, but Sarah could see confusion in their faces too. This wasn't the dramatic rescue they had expected. "You're really happy here?" Colonel Morrison asked, his voice breaking slightly on the words. Sarah nodded, then reached out and took his hands in hers. They were rough from years of frontier service, marked by scars she couldn't read, but they were gentle as they closed around her smaller fingers. "I was dying inside when Running Bear found me," she said. "Not from violence or cruelty, but from loneliness and fear. He gave me a reason to keep breathing when I wanted to follow Mama to wherever she had gone." Colonel Morrison's eyes filled with tears. He tried to blink away. "I should have been there. I should have come for you both, instead of sending money and promises." "Yes," Sarah agreed, because honesty seemed more important than kindness now. "You should have, but you can't change the past by destroying the present." She gestured toward the Apache camp, where families watched the confrontation with quiet dignity. "These people aren't your enemies. They're my family. The children here are my brothers and sisters. The elders are my grandparents. Running Bear is my father in every way that matters." Colonel Morrison followed her gaze, seeing perhaps for the first time the humanity in faces he had been trained to see as hostile. A small Apache boy peered out from behind his mother's skirt, his dark eyes curious rather than fearful. An elderly woman worked peacefully at her beadwork, her movements speaking of skills passed down through generations. "What do you want me to do?" Colonel Morrison asked, the question of a man whose certainty had crumbled beneath him. "Stop hunting us," Sarah said simply. "Stop seeing Apache people as problems to be solved, instead of families trying to live according to their traditions." Running Bear spoke then, his words carrying the weight of leadership. "Your daughter has learned our ways, but she has not forgotten yours. She reads from sacred book her mother gave her. She remembers stories of the place where she was born. We do not steal children from their people. We welcome children who have lost their people." Colonel Morrison was quiet for a long time, his military training warring with the evidence of his own eyes. Finally, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "I resign my commission," he said, the words carrying across the camp like thunder, effective immediately. His soldiers stirred behind him, uncertain how to respond to this sudden change in leadership. But Colonel Morrison seemed to have found a peace he hadn't known he was seeking. "I've spent 2 years destroying families in the name of saving my daughter," he continued. "I won't compound that mistake by taking her from the family that actually saved her." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she pulled both her fathers into an embrace that somehow managed to hold all the pain and love and complexity of her impossible situation. In that moment, she understood that choosing one didn't mean abandoning the other. She pulled back and carefully drew a picture in the dirt with her finger, two figures standing beside a smaller one, all of them connected by lines that represented the unbreakable bonds of love, chosen rather than inherited. Running Bear and Colonel Morrison looked at the simple sketch and saw in it a future none of them had imagined possible. "This is my family portrait," Sarah said, her voice strong and sure. "All of us together." The weeks that followed Colonel Morrison's resignation brought an unexpected peace to the Apache camp. The former cavalry officer had sent word to the nearest military outpost that the hostile band in the mountains posed no threat and should be left undisturbed. His military credentials carried enough weight to buy them time, though everyone understood this reprieve might not last forever. Sarah watched her biological father struggle to find his place in a world so different from anything he had known. Without his uniform and military purpose, William Morrison seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable. He had pitched a simple tent at the edge of the camp, close enough to be part of their community, but far enough to respect Apache customs about outsiders. The transition wasn't easy for anyone. Some of the younger Apache warriors remained suspicious of the man who had been hunting them so recently. Colonel Morrison, for his part, found himself grappling with guilt over the families he had destroyed in his misguided quest to rescue Sarah. Running Bear, with the wisdom that had made him a respected elder, became the bridge between two wounded men who both loved the same daughter. He approached Colonel Morrison one morning with a project that would change everything. "Your hands know work," Running Bear observed, watching the former officer mending his gear with practiced efficiency. "But do they know how to build?" Colonel Morrison looked up from his repairs, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "I've built plenty of things. Fortifications mostly. Why? Winter comes again soon. If you stay with us, you need proper shelter. Apache way is to earn your place through useful work." Running Bear gestured toward a pile of freshly cut poles. "I will teach you to build wiki up if you wish to learn." The offer was more than practical instruction. It was an invitation to become part of the community, rather than merely a visitor to it. Colonel Morrison understood the significance and nodded with the gravity the moment deserved. Sarah watched from a distance as her two fathers worked side by side, their movements initially awkward but gradually finding rhythm. Running Bear demonstrated the traditional methods of bending saplings and weaving brush, while Colonel Morrison contributed his knowledge of structural engineering to make the dwelling both authentic and sturdy. "Your father learns quickly," Gentle Rain observed, settling beside Sarah with her endless beadwork. "His hands remember how to create, instead of destroy." The comment stung because it was true. Sarah had been thinking the same thing as she watched Colonel Morrison's face relax into something approaching contentment for the first time since his arrival. "It's strange seeing them together," Sarah admitted. "I never imagined having two fathers." "Apache children often have many fathers," Gentle Rain replied with a smile. "Birth father, clan father, teaching father, spirit father. Family grows in the direction of love." As the days shortened and the first frost painted the high meadows silver, Sarah found herself drawn into conversations with Colonel Morrison that revealed sides of him she had never known. Without the rigid demands of military command, he showed glimpses of the young man her mother had fallen in love with years ago. "Your mother used to draw. Your mother used to draw. Your mother used to draw," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "Little sketches of flowers, birds, anything that caught her eye. Little sketches of flowers, birds, anything that caught her eye," she said. Art was how she remembered the beautiful moments. Sarah thought of the family portrait she had drawn in the dirt, how something so simple had captured the complexity of their situation. "I wish I had known that about her. She would have taught you, given time, that situation. I wish I had known that about her. She would have taught you, given time." Colonel Morrison's voice carried old regret. "I robbed you both of so much time." The admission hung between them, honest and much time. The admission hung between them, honest and painful. Sarah appreciated his willingness to acknowledge the cost of his choices without making excuses for them. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." Running Bear's wiki-up building lessons became a daily ritual that drew curious observers from throughout the camp. Children gathered to watch the strange sight of a former cavalry officer learning Apache construction techniques with the patient attention of a devoted student. The completed wiki-up stood as testament to what two very different men could accomplish when they worked toward a common purpose. Colonel Morrison had insisted on adding small touches that reflected his engineering background. Subtle reinforcements that would help the structure withstand heavy snow loads, drainage channels that would prevent flooding during spring melts. "Good work," Running Bear said, circling the dwelling with an appraising eye, strong like Apache way, but with white man's thinking about weather. "This is how new traditions begin." Sarah felt a surge of pride watching her fathers admire their collaborative creation. The wiki-up represented more than shelter. It was proof that different ways of knowing could strengthen each other rather than competing for dominance. As autumn deepened into the serious business of winter preparation, Colonel Morrison found his military organizational skills unexpectedly useful. He helped coordinate hunting parties with the efficiency of a quartermaster, ensuring that meat was properly distributed and preserved according to both Apache tradition and practical necessity. "Your father thinks like chief," observed one of the younger warriors, his initial suspicion gradually giving way to grudging respect. "He sees whole camp, not just his own needs." The comment reached Sarah through the informal network of camp gossip, filling her with quiet satisfaction. Colonel Morrison was earning his place through contribution rather than demanding it through blood or authority. During this time, Sarah began to understand that healing sometimes required revisiting old wounds. Running Bear encouraged her to share stories about her early life with Colonel Morrison, while urging her father to speak honestly about the dreams and failures that had shaped his choices. "I thought providing for you meant leaving you," Colonel Morrison admitted during one of their evening conversations. "Military service paid well, and I believed if I could just get established in California, build something substantial, then I could send for you both, and we'd have the life we dreamed about." "But dreams without presence are just wishes," Sarah replied, unconsciously echoing something Running Bear had taught her. "Mama needed you with us, not working for us." The truth was gentle but firm, and Colonel Morrison received it with the grace of a man learning to see his past with clearer eyes. "Your Apache father understands things I had to lose everything to learn." As winter tightened its grip on the mountains, the three of them developed routines that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings began with Colonel Morrison joining Running Bear for what had become informal strategy sessions about camp security and resource management. Sarah would often find them bent over maps, discussing the movements of other military units and the best routes for avoiding unwanted encounters. "Your knowledge of Army thinking helps us stay safe," Running Bear told Colonel Morrison. "You see dangers we might miss, and you see opportunities I never learned to recognize," Colonel Morrison replied. "I spent so many years viewing this land as territory to control instead of home to inhabit." The afternoons belonged to family time, with Sarah serving as translator between the two men when language barriers arose. She taught Colonel Morrison basic Apache phrases while helping Running Bear improve his English vocabulary. Their conversations ranged from practical matters to philosophical discussions about the nature of belonging and responsibility. One snowy evening, as they sat around their shared fire, Colonel Morrison produced a battered leather journal from his personal effects. Sarah recognized it immediately as a military field book, the kind officers used to record daily observations and strategic notes. "I've been writing down everything I'm learning here," he said, his voice uncertain. "Not for any official report, but for myself, trying to understand how I could have been so wrong about so much." Running Bear nodded approvingly. "Writing helps thoughts become clear. Your daughter does same thing with her sacred book, reads old wisdom, writes new understanding." Sarah felt a warm recognition at being included in this comparison. Her evening practice of reading from her mother's Bible had indeed evolved into something more complex, as she found herself adding her own notes in the margins, connecting biblical passages to Apache teachings about harmony and respect for creation. "Maybe someday these writings will help other soldiers understand," Sarah suggested. Help them see Apache people as families instead of enemies. Colonel Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. That's a worthy goal, though I'm not sure many would listen to the observations of a disgraced ex-cavalry officer. Truth has its own authority, Running Bear said simply. When man speaks from heart that has been changed, others feel that power. Spring's return brought both hope and uncertainty to their mountain sanctuary. The snow began its gradual retreat, revealing a world washed clean and ready for renewal. But with the warming weather came increased activity from the outside world. Traders, prospectors, and inevitably military patrols seeking to establish the government's presence in territories that had previously been left to indigenous peoples. Sarah found herself serving as a bridge between worlds more often as her unique position became clear to everyone in the camp. She could read the intentions of approaching whites in ways that pure-blood Apache could not, while understanding tribal concerns with a depth that escaped most outsiders. During one such encounter, a group of territorial surveyors arrived at their camp, seeking permission to map the area for potential railroad development. The conversation that followed revealed how much Sarah had grown in wisdom since her arrival among the Apache people. This land has been our home for generations beyond counting, Chief Gray Wolf explained to the lead surveyor, his English carefully formal. We do not understand how papers from distant cities can claim ownership of mountains and streams. The surveyor, a thin man named Peterson, with ink-stained fingers and nervous energy, shifted uncomfortably under the chief's steady gaze. It's progress, Chief. The railroad will bring prosperity to this region, jobs for your people, access to markets for trade goods. Sarah stepped forward, recognizing the fundamental misunderstanding that lay beneath this conversation. Mr. Peterson, she said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned from watching both her fathers navigate difficult negotiations. What the chief is trying to explain is that Apache people don't view land as something to be owned and sold. It's more like family pews. You don't own your mother, but you have responsibilities to care for her. Peterson's eyebrows rose as he took in Sarah's appearance, clearly white by blood, but Apache in dress and bearing. And you are Mountain Flower, Sarah replied without hesitation, daughter of Running Bear, member of the Wind Clan. Colonel Morrison had been watching this exchange from a respectful distance, but now he approached with the measured steps of a man choosing his words carefully. Mr. Peterson, I believe what my daughter is telling you deserves serious consideration. The surveyor's confusion deepened as he tried to process the relationship dynamics before him. Sarah seized the opportunity to create understanding where none had existed before. My father here, she gestured toward Colonel Morrison, served as Colonel William Morrison before he chose to live among the Apache people. He can help you understand why forcing railroad development through this territory would be both unwise and unnecessary. What followed was unlike any negotiation the surveyor had probably ever experienced. Colonel Morrison used his knowledge of government bureaucracy and military logistics to explain why alternative routes would be more practical and less expensive. Running Bear contributed traditional ecological knowledge about seasonal flooding patterns and wildlife migration routes that would affect any major construction project. Sarah translated not just language but entire ways of thinking, helping each side understand the other's concerns and priorities. By the end of the afternoon, Peterson was scribbling notes furiously while asking detailed questions about sustainable development practices that might benefit everyone involved. This is remarkable, Peterson admitted as he prepared to leave. I've never encountered such collaborative expertise in one place. After the surveyors departed, Chief Gray Wolf called a council meeting to discuss what had just occurred. The successful negotiation had implications that reached far beyond one conversation about railroad development. Mountain Flower has shown us a new way to protect our people, the chief observed. Not through war or hiding, but through making ourselves too valuable as partners to be destroyed as enemies. Running Bear nodded thoughtfully. She has gift for building bridges where others see only rivers to cross.
Colonel Morrison listened to these discussions with growing awareness of his daughter's unique abilities. That evening, as they sat around their family fire, he voiced what they were all beginning to understand. "You have a calling, Sarah," he said, using her English name with a deliberate intention. "Mountain Flower is who you are among the Apache mixed. Mountain Flower is who you are among the Apache people, but Sarah Elizabeth Morrison might be who the outside world, but Sarah Elizabeth Morrison might be who the outside Elizabeth Morrison might be who the outside world needs to hear. Elizabeth Morrison might be who the outside world needs to hear from."
Sarah touched the eagle feather she still wore close to her heart, drawing strength from its sacred power. "What do you mean?" "I mean you could be the voice that helps both worlds understand each other," Colonel Morrison replied. "Someone who belongs fully to both cultures and can speak truth to both." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah had found peace in her life among the Apache people, but she was beginning to see that her true purpose might require stepping back into the larger world with all its complexities and dangers. The letter arrived with a territorial mail carrier who had been directed to their camp by sympathetic traders. It bore the official seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and was addressed to Colonel William Morrison, care of Apache Band Wind Clan territory. Colonel Morrison opened it with hands that trembled slightly, aware that official correspondence from Washington could bring either opportunity or catastrophe. Sarah and Running Bear watched as his face cycled through surprise, concern, and something that might have been hope. "What does it say?" Sarah asked when the silence stretched too long. "They want me to serve as an official liaison," Colonel Morrison said slowly, rereading the document to make sure he understood correctly. "The Bureau has heard about my unique situation and wants to explore whether my experience could help develop new policies for peaceful coexistence." Running Bear's expression was carefully neutral. "And what would this mean for our camp?" "Protection for one thing," Colonel Morrison replied. "Official recognition that this band poses no threat and should be left undisturbed. But also," he paused, clearly struggling with the implications, "they want me to write a comprehensive report about Apache culture and governance, to help them understand how to work with tribal leaders instead of simply trying to control them." Sarah felt a chill of premonition. "Would you have to leave?" "Not permanently, but I would need to travel to other camps, interview chiefs and elders, document traditional practices." Colonel Morrison set the letter down carefully. "Essentially, they want me to become an expert on the people I was once ordered to fight." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The man who had earned the name Iron Hawk for his relentless pursuit of Apache bands was now being asked to become their advocate within the very system that had sent him to destroy them. Chief Grey Wolf was consulted, and after much deliberation, the tribal council reached a decision that surprised everyone. They would support Colonel Morrison's appointment, but with conditions that reflected hard-won wisdom about dealing with government officials. "If you speak for Apache people to white leaders," Chief Grey Wolf told Colonel Morrison during a formal council meeting, "you must speak our true words, not words they want to hear." "I understand," Colonel Morrison replied solemnly. "And you must remember that you speak as friend, not as master. Apache people have our own voices. You help make those voices heard, not replace them with your own." The distinction was crucial, and Sarah saw her father absorb it with the gravity it deserved. This wasn't about becoming a spokesperson for the Apache people, but about becoming a translator who could help government officials understand what they were actually saying. As preparations began for Colonel Morrison's new role, Sarah found herself grappling with mixed emotions. Pride in her father's transformation from destroyer to protector, warred with fear about what his absence might mean for their carefully constructed family harmony. "Will things change between us?" she asked, Running Bear during one of their evening conversations. "Everything changes," Running Bear replied with characteristic wisdom. "Seasons change, children grow, rivers find new paths to the sea. Question is not whether change comes, but whether we meet it with wisdom or fear." Sarah understood what he was really telling her. The peace they had found in their mountain sanctuary had always been temporary. The world was shifting around them, and they could either help guide that change or be overwhelmed by it. Colonel Morrison spent his final weeks in camp, gathering information and learning protocols that would help him serve effectively as a liaison. He conducted formal interviews with elders, documented traditional dispute resolution methods, and compiled detailed observations about Apache agricultural and hunting practices. But perhaps more importantly, he used this time to strengthen his relationship with Sarah. They took long walks through the mountain trails where she had learned to move like the wind, and he shared stories about his own childhood that helped her understand the man he had been before military service hardened him. "I want you to know," he said during one of these walks, "that accepting this position doesn't mean I'm choosing duty over family again. This time the duty is to protect the family I've found here." Sarah touched the eagle feather at her throat, drawing strength from its reminder that courage sometimes meant soaring into uncertain winds. "I know," she said, "and I think Mama would be proud of the man you've become." The words seemed to lift a weight from Colonel Morrison's shoulders that he had been carrying for years. As they headed back toward camp, Sarah realized that healing sometimes required not just forgiveness, but the courage to become worthy of that forgiveness. The ceremonial pipe appeared in Chief Grey Wolf's hands like a sacred promise made manifest. Carved from red stone and decorated with traditional symbols that spoke of peace between peoples, it had been crafted specifically for the occasion by the tribe's most skilled artisan. "This pipe will travel with you," Chief Grey Wolf told Colonel Morrison during the formal ceremony marking his departure. "When you speak with government leaders, you will smoke with them as Apache people do when making agreements that must be honored." Colonel Morrison accepted the pipe with the reverence it deserved, understanding that he was being entrusted with something far more valuable than mere diplomatic protocol. The pipe represented the hopes of an entire people that their way of life might survive the coming changes through understanding rather than conquest. Sarah watched the ceremony with emotions that pulled her in multiple directions. Pride in her father's transformation mingled with anxiety about his upcoming journey and uncertainty about her own role in the larger story that was unfolding around them. "The pipe carries responsibility," Running Bear explained to her later as they prepared Colonel Morrison's travel supplies. "When man smokes sacred pipe, he calls on spirits to witness his words. He cannot lie or break faith without consequences that reach beyond this world." The weight of that responsibility was evident in Colonel Morrison's demeanor as he made his final preparations. His military precision had returned, but tempered now with the patience and respect he had learned during his months among the Apache people. "I've written letters of introduction to several sympathetic officials," he told Sarah as they walked together through the camp one last time. "People who might be willing to listen to new approaches if the arguments are compelling enough." "And if they're not willing to listen?" Sarah asked. Colonel Morrison paused beside the wickiup he had built with Running Bear's guidance, running his hand along the carefully woven walls that had sheltered him through his transformation from enemy to family member. "Then I'll find others who will," he said simply. "This isn't about changing everyone's mind overnight. It's about planting seeds that might grow into better policies years from now." The morning of his departure dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the high meadows silver. The entire camp gathered to witness Colonel Morrison's leave-taking, a ceremony that would have been unimaginable just months before. Running Bear presented him with a final gift, a set of Apache travel clothes that would allow him to move through certain territories more safely than military uniform would permit. "When you wear these," Running Bear said, helping Colonel Morrison adjust the traditional shirt and leggings, "you carry our prayers with you. You are no longer Iron Hawk, who brings destruction. You are Bridge Walker, who carries understanding between peoples." The new name carried weight that everyone present could feel. Sarah watched her biological father accept this Apache identity with humility that would have been impossible for the rigid cavalry officer who had arrived in their camp seeking a captive daughter. As the moment for departure arrived, Sarah found herself fighting back tears she hadn't expected. This felt different from the other separations she had endured. Not like abandonment, but like the natural growth that comes when family members pursue their calling in service of something larger than themselves. "I'll write to you," Colonel Morrison promised, embracing her with fierce tenderness. "And I'll return when the circuit is complete. This is your home, and you are my daughter. Nothing will change that." "Bring us news of the world beyond these mountains," Sarah replied. "Help us understand what changes are coming so we can prepare wisely." Running Bear clasped Colonel Morrison's hands in the Apache farewell that acknowledged both departure and connection. "Safe travels, Bridgewalker. May your words find fertile ground in the hearts of those who have power to choose peace over war." As Colonel Morrison mounted his horse and rode toward the trail that would take him back into the white world, Sarah felt a shift in her own understanding of her place in the larger story. She was no longer simply the rescued child or the cultural bridge. She was becoming something new, a young woman with roots in both worlds and the wisdom to help others navigate the challenging terrain between them. The ceremonial pipe went with Colonel Morrison, but its meaning remained in the camp as a reminder that some responsibilities transcend individual choice and become sacred obligations to future generations. Watching her father disappear around a bend in the mountain trail, Sarah touched the eagle feather at her throat and whispered a prayer for his success in the difficult work ahead. The letter that arrived 3 months later bore handwriting Sarah recognized immediately, though the paper was finer than anything Colonel Morrison had used in their mountain camp. The official Bureau of Indian Affairs letterhead spoke of his success in navigating the bureaucratic waters of Washington, while his words carried the warmth of a father writing to his beloved daughter. "My dearest mountain flower," the letter began, using the Apache name that had become as natural to him as breathing. "I write this from the capital, where your father has become something of a curiosity, the cavalry officer who chose to live among the Apache rather than fight them." Sarah shared the letter with Running Bear that evening as they sat beside their familiar fire. The old warrior listened intently as she translated the English into Apache, nodding approvingly at certain passages that spoke of Colonel Morrison's growing influence within government circles. "He says the Secretary of Interior has agreed to meet with Apache representatives next spring," Sarah explained. "Not to dictate terms, but to discuss mutual agreements that might prevent future conflicts." "Bridgewalker keeps his promises," Running Bear observed with satisfaction. "His words carry weight because his heart has been changed by truth." The letter contained more than just political updates. Colonel Morrison wrote about the strange experience of defending Apache culture to men who had never seen beyond their own assumptions about savage peoples. He described presenting Chief Gray Wolf's sophisticated governance structures to officials who were amazed to learn that Apache society operated according to complex diplomatic protocols. "One senator actually asked me if Apache people had their own laws," the letter continued. "I told him about the tribal council system, about how disputes are resolved through discussion rather than force, about the way leadership is earned through wisdom rather than inherited through birth." He sat in stunned silence for several minutes before admitting he had never considered that indigenous peoples might have governance systems superior to our own in many respects. Sarah felt a surge of pride reading these passages. Her father was doing exactly what Chief Gray Wolf had asked, speaking Apache truths rather than words government officials wanted to hear. But the letter also contained news that created ripples of concern throughout the camp. Other Apache bands were facing increasing pressure as railroad development and mining interests pushed deeper into traditional territories. Some groups were choosing armed resistance, while others were being forced onto reservations where conditions were often deliberately harsh. "Your father warns that we may face choices soon," Running Bear said after hearing the complete letter. "Stay hidden in these mountains and risk being hunted down, or engage with government officials while we still have some influence over the terms." The dilemma was one that indigenous peoples across the continent were facing as the tide of westward expansion accelerated. Sarah understood that their peaceful mountain sanctuary, while precious, might not remain safe indefinitely. But Colonel Morrison's letter also offered hope. He had arranged for Apache leaders to testify before congressional committees about their experiences and perspectives. He was building networks of sympathetic officials who might support policies based on cooperation rather than conquest. "I dream of a day," he wrote, "when my daughter's children can grow up in a world where being Apache is not something to hide, but something to celebrate, where the wisdom of indigenous peoples is recognized as a gift to the entire nation rather than an obstacle to progress." The letter closed with personal news that made Sarah's heart ache with longing. Colonel Morrison had visited her mother's grave during his travels, had placed wildflowers there, and shared stories about the remarkable young woman their daughter had become. "Your mother would be so proud," he wrote, "not just of the courage you showed in surviving such loss, but of the wisdom you've gained in bridging two worlds that desperately need what you have learned. You are becoming exactly the person she dreamed you might be." That night, Sarah lay in her wickiup holding the letter close to her heart, feeling the weight of the expectations and opportunities it represented. The paper itself had become precious, tangible proof that love could survive separation, and that family bonds could grow stronger, even across great distances. Running Bear's quiet breathing nearby reminded her that she was not facing these challenges alone. Whatever choices lay ahead, she would meet them with the strength that came from being loved by two fathers who had each taught her different aspects of courage. The letter rustled softly in her hands as she folded it carefully for safekeeping, a sound like whispered promises carried on mountain wind. The treaty document that arrived with the spring thaw was unlike anything the Apache people had ever seen. Written in both English and carefully translated Apache, it bore the seals of multiple government agencies and represented months of Colonel Morrison's careful negotiation behind the scenes in Washington. Chief Gray Wolf called a council meeting that would determine the fate of their band and potentially influence the future of all Apache peoples. The entire camp gathered in solemn assembly as the chief read aloud the terms that Bridge Walker had helped craft. This agreement recognizes the Wind Clan as a sovereign people with rights to self-governance within our traditional territory. In exchange, we provide consultation on land use decisions and assistance with maintaining peace between Apache bands and white settlers. Sarah listened to the terms with growing amazement. This wasn't the typical government document that demanded submission in exchange for basic survival. Colonel Morrison had somehow convinced officials to create a partnership agreement that acknowledged Apache rights while addressing practical concerns about territorial development. "We keep our ceremonies, our language, our traditional leadership structure," the chief continued reading. "Our children can be educated in Apache ways, while also learning skills needed to navigate the changing world." Running Bear leaned forward intently as the details unfolded. The treaty included provisions for Apache participation in regional planning decisions, guaranteed hunting and gathering rights across traditional seasonal territories, and most remarkably, official recognition of Apache law within their designated lands. "Bridge Walker has given us something I did not think possible," Running Bear said when the reading concluded. "A chance to survive as Apache people instead of becoming imitation white people." But the treaty also came with obligations that would change their lives significantly. Apache representatives would need to attend regular meetings with territorial officials, participate in conflict mediation when disputes arose, and provide testimony to government committees studying indigenous affairs. The burden will fall heaviest on those who can speak both languages and understand both ways of thinking, Chief Gray Wolf observed, his eyes finding Sarah in the assembled crowd. Sarah felt the weight of that observation settle on her shoulders like a sacred responsibility. She was being called to step fully into the role she had been unconsciously preparing for since her arrival in their camp, becoming a bridge between worlds that desperately needed to understand each other. "I'm ready," she said, rising to address the council with a confidence that surprised even herself. "My father, Running Bear, taught me to be strong like eagle.
My father, Bridge Walker, taught me to see through white eyes. My mother, Margaret, taught me to find goodness in unexpected places. I can use all of these gifts to serve our people. The formal vote on the treaty was unanimous, but not without lengthy discussion about implementation details and potential challenges. Sarah found herself appointed as junior liaison, working under the guidance of Chief Grey Wolf and other elders to ensure that Apache interests were protected as the agreement took effect. As the council meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Running Bear approached Sarah with something he had been crafting during the long winter months. It was a leather portfolio, beautifully decorated with traditional beadwork and designed to hold the important documents that would now be part of her life. For keeping treaty papers and letters safe, he explained, his weathered hands tracing the intricate patterns he had stitched with such care, but also for keeping record of our experiences as we learned to live in this new way. Sarah accepted the portfolio with reverence, understanding that it represented more than practical necessity. Like the wooden doll he had carved for her years ago, this was Running Bear's way of acknowledging her growth and preparing her for the challenges ahead. "You've taught me everything I need to know," she said, embracing the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered. "No," Running Bear replied gently. "I taught you how to learn me. Now you will teach yourself what the future requires."
That evening, as Sarah carefully placed the signed treaty in her new portfolio alongside Colonel Morrison's letters, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened child who had been traded to an Apache warrior was becoming a young woman with the power to influence the fate of two peoples. The leather portfolio rested beside her as she fell asleep, solid and real as the promises it contained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was simply Mountain Flower, beloved daughter of Running Bear, keeper of treaties and dreams. 5 years had passed since the treaty signing, and the framed photograph on Sarah's desk told a story that would have seemed impossible to imagine in those early, desperate days. The image captured 3 generations of an unconventional family, herself at 21, confident and poised in a dress that blended Apache and contemporary American styles. Running Bear, his weathered face creased with pride, and Colonel Morrison returned from his diplomatic travels with silver threading his hair and wisdom deepening his eyes. But the photograph also included 2 new faces that completed their circle. James Crow Feather, a young Apache man who had become Sarah's husband the previous spring, stood with his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. And in her arms, barely 6 months old, was little Margaret Running Bear Morrison Crow Feather, named for the grandmother she would never meet, but whose legacy lived on in her mother's stories. Sarah had insisted on including all the names in her daughter's identity, refusing to let any part of her complex heritage be forgotten. The child would grow up knowing she belonged to multiple worlds and was strengthened by each of them. The photograph had been taken at the dedication of the Apache American Cultural Center, a building that stood as testament to what cooperation could accomplish. Part school, part meeting hall, part museum, it served Apache children who needed to navigate both traditional and modern education while providing a place for white visitors to learn about indigenous culture with respect rather than curiosity. "She has your mother's eyes," Running Bear observed, settling into the chair beside Sarah's desk with the deliberate movements of a man whose years had earned him the right to rest when he chose to. Same kindness, same strength. Sarah looked down at her sleeping daughter, marveling at how peaceful the baby appeared, despite the complexity of the world she had inherited. "I hope she'll have an easier path than I did." "Different path," Running Bear corrected gently. "Each generation faces its own mountains to climb." Colonel Morrison entered the office, carrying the morning's correspondence, his role as official liaison having evolved into something like a permanent position, bridging Apache and government interests. His letters now came from senators and territorial governors, seeking his insight on indigenous affairs, a far cry from the military dispatches that had once defined his purpose. News from Washington, he announced, settling into his own chair and sorting through the papers with practiced efficiency. The president wants to use our treaty as a model for agreements with other tribes across the territories. Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with responsibility. Their success had attracted attention from far beyond their mountain valleys, and with that attention came pressure to prove that cooperation between indigenous peoples and the expanding American nation was not just possible, but beneficial for everyone involved. "Are you ready for that kind of visibility?" Colonel Morrison asked, studying his daughter's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of her moods. "We've been preparing for it our whole lives," Sarah replied, gesturing toward the framed photograph that captured their unlikely family's journey. "Mama taught me to find goodness in unexpected places. Running Bear taught me that family is created through choice and love. You taught me that people can change when they're willing to see truth. All of that prepared me for this moment." Little Margaret stirred in her arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to take in the world with startling awareness for such a young child. Sarah adjusted the traditional Apache blanket that kept her daughter warm, the same pattern that had wrapped around her own shoulders during that first terrifying ride away from the wagon train so many years ago. "The circle completes itself," Running Bear said, watching the baby's tiny fingers grasp at the air. "What was lost returns in new form." As afternoon light slanted through the windows of the cultural center, illuminating displays that told the story of Apache resilience and adaptation, Sarah understood that she had become exactly what her mother had hoped for, someone who could find and create goodness, even in the most unexpected circumstances. The framed photograph caught the light, its subject smiling with the quiet confidence of people who had learned that family transcends blood, that love conquers fear, and that bridges built with patience and respect can span any divide. Outside, children's voices carried on the mountain wind as Apache and white students played together in the schoolyard, their laughter a promise that future generations might inherit a world where difference was celebrated rather than feared. Sarah held her daughter close and whispered the first words little Margaret would remember. "You belong everywhere, little bird. The whole world is your home."